My name is not important. What's important is the context, the stage upon which this quiet little nightmare unfolded. I live in Maple Creek Crest, HOA-controlled enclave tucked away in the heart of what you'd call one-story America. It's the kind of place people move to when they're done with the chaos of the world. When they want neatly trimmed boxwood hedges, streets named after trees, and the gentle, predictable hum of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. I ended up here after the divorce. The silence of my own three-bedroom rancher was preferable to the shouting matches that had filled my previous life. Here, the silence was communal, a shared agreement among neighbors to keep the volume of life turned firmly down to a 2. For 10 years, the gold standard of Maple Creek Crest. The family we were all silently measured against was the Millers. They lived directly across the street in a house that was the mirror image of my own, yet it always seemed to exist in a higher definition. Their lawn was a flawless emerald carpet. Their driveway was sealed every fall without fail, and their white picket fence stood straight and proud without a single flake of paint out of place. Tom Miller was a financial advisor with a handshake that was both firm and reassuring. Sarah Miller taught piano, and the sound of scales floating through their open window on summer evenings was as much a part of the neighborhood as the crickets. Their daughter, Emily, was a sweet, quiet girl of about 12. With blonde pigtails and a smile that never seemed to falter. Their perfection wasn't obnoxious. It was aspirational. They were the living, breathing embodiment of the HOA covenant. I'd see Tom out with his push-reel mower, a relic he used to get those perfect stripes, and we'd share a nod. I'd see Sarah arranging flowers on their porch, her movements fluid and economical. And I never, not once in a decade, heard a raised voice or a slamming door. Their life was a seamless, well-oiled machine, and I, along with everyone else, admired it from a distance. It was a picture of stability, something I desperately needed in my own fractured existence. My own life was a study in quiet mediocrity. I work from home as a technical writer, translating engineer speak into user manuals for kitchen appliances. It's not glamorous, but it pays the mortgage on my beige rancher and keeps my mind occupied. My days are a rhythm of coffee, emails, and the slow, ticking clock. Evenings are for microwave dinners and the faint blue glow of the television. I'd gotten used to the rhythm, to the point where the highlight of my week was taking the trash bins to the curb on Thursday nights. It was a ritual, a small act of participation in the civic religion of suburbia. That's what I was doing last Thursday. The air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. The street was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the sodium vapor lamps. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the Miller's refrigerator from across the street. Their garage door was open, which was unusual for that time of night. Tom's SUV was parked inside, and a single, bare bulb illuminated the space. I saw him then, standing over a workbench. At first, I thought he was fixing a small appliance, a toaster, maybe, or a radio. He had a small, precision screwdriver in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. But he wasn't working on an appliance. Lying on a soft towel spread over the workbench was Emily. She was in her pajamas, eyes closed, her face serene in sleep. It was a tender sight, a father letting his daughter sleep while he worked late. But then I saw his other hand. It was cradling the back of her head, holding it steady. And the screwdriver. He was inserting the tip of it into something on the nape of her neck, just below her hairline. He gave it a gentle, quarter turn, like a technician calibrating a sensitive instrument. A soft, metallic asterisk click asterisk echoed in the still garage. My blood ran cold. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, or my shoe scuffed the asphalt. Tom Miller's head snapped up. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled at the corners, locked onto mine. There was no surprise in them, no panic, no guilt. There was nothing there at all. It was a flat, empty gaze, like a doll's eyes. He didn't smile or frown. He just stared, the screwdriver still poised in his hand. Emily, on the table, didn't stir. I stood there, frozen, a bag of trash clutched in my hand like a pathetic shield. I managed to mumble something, a strangled evening, Tom, before turning and practically running back up my driveway. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I fumbled with my door, locked it behind me, and leaned against it, breathing heavily. What had I just seen? A father adjusting his daughter. The rational part of my brain, the technical writer, scrambled for an explanation. A medical device. Some kind of new age chiropractic thing. But the look in Tom's eyes, that was no doctor's look. That was the look of a mechanic. And the memory of that tiny, precise click replayed in my mind, a sound that felt utterly, profoundly wrong. The perfect picture had cracked, and something terrifying was staring out from behind it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The soft glow of the garage, Emily's sleeping form, and the cold, deliberate action of Tom Miller with that screwdriver. The image was burned onto the back of my eyelids. I spent the night pacing my living room, peering through the slats of my blinds at the dark, silent house across the street. It looked just as it always had, a perfect little diorama of suburban life, but it felt different now. It felt like a mask. The next morning, the world had returned to its scheduled programming. The sun was shining, sprinklers were hissing to life, and the Miller's garage door was closed. I felt a wave of surreal disorientation. Had I imagined it? Had the loneliness and my own mundane life finally conjured up some bizarre fantasy? I made a pot of coffee so strong it was almost sludge, trying to anchor myself in reality. But the memory was too vivid, too specific. The sound of that click was a hook lodged deep in my mind. I tried to work, but my focus was shattered. My desk faces the window, a choice I'd always appreciated for the natural light. Now, it felt like a vulnerability. I found myself staring across the street, my fingers frozen above the keyboard. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Tom Miller emerged, dressed in a crisp blue suit. He picked up the newspaper from his driveway, rolled it neatly, and walked back inside. Normal. At 7:45, Sarah Miller came out to retrieve the mail, even though it wouldn't be delivered for hours. She always did this, a little quirk I'd never thought about. Now, it seemed like a programmed action, a character in a video game performing its idle animation. My opportunity for a closer look came around noon. I had to mail a package, a flimsy excuse but one I clung to. I walked down my driveway, my senses on high alert. As I passed the Miller's house, I saw them through their large kitchen window. They were sitting at the table, having lunch, and they were all eating in perfect unison. Tom would lift his fork, Sarah would lift her fork, Emily would lift her fork. They would chew, their jaws moving in a slow, identical rhythm. They swallowed at the same time. It wasn't just coordinated. It was synchronized, like a well-rehearsed dance troupe or a row of metronomes set to the same tempo. I stopped walking, pretending to tie my shoe, my heart thudding in my chest. I watched them for a full minute, maybe two. The synchronicity was unnerving. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. They just ate, their movements fluid and identical. Then, as I stared, something else caught my eye. Tom Miller blinked. A moment later, Sarah blinked, then Emily. It wasn't the random, unconscious blink of a human being. It was a slow, deliberate closing and opening of the eyelids, one after the other, like a wave passing through them. The interval was precise, maybe once every 7 or 8 seconds. My own breath hitched. This was wrong. This was so deeply, fundamentally wrong. I hurried to the mailbox, my hands trembling. The normalcy of the street, the chirping birds, the distant sound of a child laughing, it all felt like a thin veneer painted over something monstrous. I was no longer just a curious neighbor. I was a witness to a malfunction. I had seen the glitch in the matrix, and now the code was starting to look frayed and digital all around me. The perfection of Maple Creek Crest wasn't an achievement. It was a requirement, a performance, and I had just seen backstage. Returning to my house felt like entering a bunker. I locked the door and drew all the blinds. The silence of my home was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive. I was alone with the terrifying knowledge that the world outside my door was a lie. The Millers weren't just a perfect family. They were something else. Something that needed to be calibrated with a screwdriver. Something that blinked on a timer. The question now wasn't what I had seen, but how far it went. Were the Millers the only ones, or was my entire neighborhood inhabited? The next few days were a descent into a quiet, isolating paranoia. My work suffered immensely. How could I concentrate on writing about the optimal settings for a convection oven when I was living next to that? My world had shrunk to the rectangle of my window and the street beyond. I became a prisoner in my own home, a scholar of the bizarre. My notes app filled with timestamps and observations that would sound insane to anyone else. I started watching the other houses, the Garcias 2 doors down, with their immaculate rose bushes, the Wilsons with their matching golden retrievers. I looked for the patterns, the tells, and once I knew what to look for, I saw them everywhere. Mr. Garcia and his son would mow their lawn in perfect, parallel lines, turning at the exact same moment without a single word or signal. Mrs. Wilson and her friend would power walk every afternoon at 3:15 p.m., their strides identical, their arms pumping in unison. Their conversation a low, rhythmic murmur that never seemed to vary in pitch or intensity. It was the blinking that confirmed it for me. Once I noticed it with the Millers, I couldn't stop seeing it. I'd see old Mr. Peterson watering his petunias, and his blinks were slow and measured. I'd see the teenage Carson boy skateboarding, and even he, with his baggy jeans and rebellious slouch, would blink with that same, unnatural regularity. It was a neighborhood-wide tick, a shared flaw in the programming. The entire community was moving to the same silent, unseen clock. Maple Creek Crest wasn't a neighborhood. It was a colony, a hive. The sheer scale of it was suffocating. I was surrounded. How many of them were there? A dozen families. 30 more. Was I the only real person here? The thought was dizzying, a profound loneliness that was colder than the vacuum of space. I thought about calling someone, the police, a friend from my old life. But what would I say? Hello, officer. My neighbors are to synchronized, and I think one of them might be an android. They'd laugh, or worse, they'd send a social worker. And what if the person on the other end of the line was one of them? What if this phenomenon wasn't confined to my little suburb? My fear curdled into a desperate, knowing curiosity. I had to know more. I had to find proof, something tangible I could hold in my hands. The source of the truth had to be inside one of their houses. It had to be inside the Millers. They were the epicenter, the model of this perfection. I knew it was insane, a felony, but the compulsion was stronger than my fear. I felt like I was losing my mind, and the only way to keep a grip on it was to confirm that the nightmare was real. I started planning my intrusion, watching their routines with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. Their most predictable window was Tuesday afternoons. Sarah Miller took Emily to her piano lesson at 4 p.m. sharp. Tom Miller never returned from his office before 5:45 p.m. That gave me a 45-minute window. A lifetime. The plan was simple, reckless, and born of a mind fraying at the edges. I would wait. I would watch. And when the coast was clear, I would walk right across the street, pick the simple lock on their back door, and step into the belly of the beast. I was no longer a technical writer. I was an investigator, an explorer charting a terrifying new world. And tomorrow was Tuesday. Tuesday arrived draped in a blanket of oppressive normalcy. The sun was bright. The sky was a cheery, impossible blue. It felt like a mockery. The hours dragged, each minute a lead weight. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sit still. At 3:55 p.m., I took my position by the window, a cold sweat prickling on my back. My heart was a frantic drum solo against my ribs. At 4 p.m. exactly, Sarah Miller's sedan backed out of the driveway, Emily visible in the passenger seat. They turned the corner and disappeared. The house was empty. Now or never. I grabbed the small leather pouch containing a set of lockpicks, a relic from a brief, misguided teenage obsession, and slipped out my back door. I cut through to backyards, my movements feeling clumsy and loud compared to the eerie grace of my neighbors. I approached the Miller's house from the rear, my eyes scanning the windows of the surrounding homes. Were there faces in those windows? Were they watching me? The air was still and heavy. The back door was a solid oak panel with a standard deadbolt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the tension wrench. I fumbled, the pick slipping. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the storm in my nerves. Click. The lock gave way. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it silently behind me. I was in. The air in their house was different. It was cool, odorless. There was no lingering scent of cooking, no perfume, no lived-in humanity. It smelled sterile, like a hospital or a laboratory. The kitchen was immaculate, of course. Not a single crumb on the counter, not a water spot on the faucet. I moved into the living room. It was like a furniture showroom. The magazines on the coffee table were fanned out with geometric precision. The pillows on the sofa were plumped and arranged at identical angles. There were family photos on the walls, but as I looked closer, the smiles seemed fixed, the eyes a little too wide, a little too vacant. It was a convincing replica of a home, but it lacked a soul. My target was the refrigerator. It was a strange, instinctive thought. If they weren't human, what did they eat? I walked to the large, stainless steel unit, my reflection a distorted, pale ghost in its surface. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. This was it. This was the moment the last vestige of my rational world would either be confirmed or shattered. I pulled the door open. There was no food. No milk, no eggs, no leftover casserole. The shelves were gone, replaced by a series of clear, rigid tubes and metal racks. And on those racks stood rows of opaque, white plastic containers, each about the size of a large thermos. They were connected to the fridge's internal systems by thin, flexible hoses. A low, mechanical hum filled the air. A soft, yellow light from within the fridge illuminated the contents of one of the containers that had been placed in the door shelf. It was a translucent canister, and it was filled with a viscous, yellowish liquid. Suspended in the liquid were what looked like thin, fleshy filaments, slowly undulating as if in a gentle current. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth. The refrigerator door swung shut with a soft, definitive thump. This wasn't a kitchen appliance. It was a charging station, a feeding station. The images flooded my brain, the synchronization, the blinking, the calibration in the garage. These weren't biorobots or androids in the classic sense. They were something organic, something grown, something that needed to be filled with that nutrient slurry. Maple Creek Crest was a farm, a terrarium, a testing ground for these things, these mimics. And I was the lab rat who had stumbled out of its cage. Panic seized me, cold and absolute. I had to get out. I turned to flee, my legs feeling like rubber, and my shoulder bumped a small side table. A delicate porcelain figurine of a ballerina wobbled, teetered on the edge, and then fell to the hardwood floor. The sound of its shattering was like a gunshot in the profound silence of the house. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I was no longer an invisible observer. I had tripped the alarm. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at the white shards of porcelain scattered across the polished floor, each piece a tiny accusation. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was listening. It was holding its breath. Then, the sound I dreaded most. The soft, electronic chirp of a car door being locked, right outside. Sarah and Emily were home, early. Adrenaline flooded my system, burning away the paralysis. I couldn't go out the back. They might come that way. I scrambled towards the front of the house, staying low, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I peered through the narrow window beside the front door. Sarah's car was in the driveway, the driver's side door still open. But she and Emily weren't getting out. They were just sitting there, perfectly still, staring straight ahead through the windshield. It was more terrifying than if they had been running towards the house. I had to risk it. I unlocked the front door, pulled it open just enough to slip through, and darted across their lawn, not towards my house, but towards the cover of the large spruce tree in the Wilsons' yard next door. I pressed myself against the rough bark, my lungs burning, and looked back. Sarah and Emily were now standing beside their car. They weren't looking at their house. They weren't looking at the broken back door I'd left slightly ajar. They were both turned, their heads cocked at the exact same angle, staring directly at the spot where I had just been standing at the Miller's front door. Their faces were blank. Utterly, completely empty of any emotion, no anger, no confusion, no surprise. It was the same flat, doll-like gaze Tom had given me in the garage. Then, slowly, in perfect unison, their heads swiveled. Their eyes scanned their lawn, the street, and then, with a chilling, mechanical precision, locked onto my hiding place behind the spruce tree. They couldn't possibly see me. The branches were thick, but they were staring right at me. They knew. I broke cover and ran. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I sprinted across my lawn, fumbled with my keys, and burst into my house, slamming the door and throwing every lock. I ran to the window and peered out. Sarah and Emily were still standing by their car, still staring at my house. A moment later, Tom Miller's SUV turned onto the street and pulled into the driveway. He got out, briefcase in hand. He didn't greet his wife and daughter. He simply walked up to them, and all three of them stood there, motionless, their faces turned towards my home. A silent, unified front. The message was clear. The game was up. They knew that I knew. The facade was no longer necessary, at least not with me. The performance was over, and now I was facing the reality behind it. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of catatonic shock, huddled on my couch in the dark. What were they going to do? Come for me in the night? Dissolve me in a vat of that yellow liquid? I was a variable in their experiment, an anomaly that needed to be corrected. I was waiting for the knock on the door, but it never came. The silence was worse. The next morning, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of a tree branch against the roof, sent jolts of pure terror through me. I was exhausted, strung out on fear and caffeine. As the sun rose, casting long, accusing shadows, I forced myself to look outside. The Millers were gone. Their cars were gone. The house looked empty. A fragile, desperate hope bloomed in my chest. Maybe they had left. Maybe I had scared them off. Maybe it was over. That hope died at exactly 8:17 a.m. It started with Tom Miller. He walked out of his front door, not in his suit, but in casual khakis and a polo shirt. He didn't get in his car. He didn't retrieve the newspaper. He simply walked to the center of his perfectly striped lawn and stopped. He stood facing my house, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. A moment later, Sarah emerged. She walked to a spot beside him and stood in the same posture. Then Emily. They formed a neat, evenly spaced line on their grass, a silent, unmoving tableau. Then, across the street, the Garcias emerged from their home. Mr. Garcia, Mrs. Garcia, their two sons. They walked to their lawn and assumed the same position, all five of them turning their heads to face my window. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled to another window, my panic rising. The Wilsons were on their lawn. The Petersons were on theirs. Up and down the street, as far as I could see in both directions, my neighbors were filing out of their homes and taking up positions on their front lawns. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all standing perfectly still. All with their faces utterly blank. All with their eyes wide open, fixed directly on my house. It was a coordinated display of power, a silent siege. There was no shouting, no threats, no gestures. Just observation, an unblinking, collective stare. I was the exhibit in the zoo now. I was the specimen under the microscope. I ran from window to window, my mind unraveling. They were everywhere. Every single house. The entire neighborhood. I was completely, utterly surrounded. I slammed the blinds shut, plunging the house into a murky twilight. But it didn't matter. I could feel their gaze through the walls, through the closed slats. It was a physical pressure, a weight on my soul. Hours passed. The silence from outside was absolute. No lawnmowers, no chattering, no cars. Just the deafening quiet of dozens of people standing and staring. I dared to peek through a small gap in the blinds. They hadn't moved a muscle. They were as still as statues. How was it possible? Humans couldn't do that. Their eyes must be drying out, their muscles cramping. But they weren't human. The last of my denial evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard truth. I was living in a nest of something I couldn't comprehend. What was their endgame? To wait me out, to drive me insane with the sheer psychological terror of their observation. It was working. I was crouched on my floor, rocking back and forth, tears of frustration and fear streaming down my face. I was trapped. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't run. If I stepped outside, what would they do? Would they just watch? Or would the programming finally break, and would they descend upon me with that same, silent, efficient purpose? The not knowing was a torture in itself. The perfect neighborhood had become a perfect prison. That was 3 days ago. They are still out there. They stand on their lawns from sunrise to sunset, a silent, unmoving army of the suburban undead. They don't eat. They don't drink. They don't speak. They don't blink. They just watch. At night, they retreat into their homes, and the street is plunged into an even deeper, more menacing darkness. I don't know what they do in there. Recharge. Refuel from those containers in the fridge. Report on the progress of their unstable human variable. I haven't slept since it began. I'm living on canned beans and bottled water, terrified of the noise the microwave might make. The power is still on. The water still runs. The infrastructure of my prison is maintained. I've tried closing all the blinds, but I can't stand not being able to see them. As terrifying as their gaze is, not knowing where they are is worse. So I sit here, at my desk, in the gloom, and I watch them back. It's a standoff between one frantic, terrified human and a street full of patient, unfeeling things. I've started writing this down. Maybe it's a final testament. Maybe it's just a way to keep my mind from completely snapping. I'm typing this up, and I'll save it to a cloud drive, something that might survive whatever happens to me. If anyone ever reads this, know that it's true. Every word. Maple Creek Crest is not a place. It's an experiment, and I have failed the test. They haven't made a move towards the house. There's no need. Their strategy is one of psychological attrition. They are waiting for me to break, to do something stupid, or to simply give up. My phone has no signal. My internet was cut an hour ago. The last tether to the outside world, severed. They are tightening the noose, silently, without any visible effort. The sun is starting to set now, casting long, distorted shadows of the silent watchers across the street. Soon, they will turn in perfect unison and walk back into their homes. The street will be empty, but the feeling of being watched will not go away. It never does. It has become a part of me, a constant, humming dread in the base of my skull. I am so tired. My eyes are raw from staring, from crying, from lack of sleep. I look at their blank, placid faces, and I see the future. A future of perfect, silent lawns and unblinking eyes. A future without chaos, without emotion, without the beautiful, messy imperfection of being human. They have one. This is my life now. Sitting in the dark, waiting, while my perfect neighbors stand guard outside. They don't need to come in. They already have me.